The desert showed no mercy. The sun, a blinding white eye in a cloudless blue expanse, beat down without forgiveness. Beneath it, a lone figure staggered, half woman, half wraith, dragging her battered body across an endless wasteland of burning gold. Her linen robe, once woven finely by loving hands, now hung from her frame in shreds, stained with salt from sweat and blood from cracked skin. The soles of her feet were torn raw by stones hidden beneath the drifting sands. Her hands, once delicate and adorned with bangles, were blistered and bleeding. Her swollen belly was the only part of her body that still seemed alive, taut and full with the child growing within. She cradled it with trembling arms as if shielding it from the sun's cruel gaze. Her name was Nafrini, but even that seemed like a dream now, a distant whisper carried away on the hot winds. Hunger gnawed at her insides, twisting her gut into knots. Thirst burned her throat like fire. She could barely see, her vision fractured by heat mirages that promised rivers and palm trees, and shade that always disappeared when she stumbled toward them. She was no longer certain if she was alive or already walking among the dead. Days ago, or was it weeks, her village by the banks of the Nile had been alive with music and laughter. The festival of Opet had drawn neighbors from distant nomes. Children had danced around fires. Mothers had painted their daughters' faces with ochre and crushed lotus petals, and fathers had offered prayers to Amun, hoping for prosperous harvests. Nafrini had laughed too, her heart full of hope, her hands resting proudly on the curve of her belly. She had named her unborn son in her mind, Menmaatre, a strong name for a strong boy. But the raiders had come that night, blackened faces, howling like jackals, their blades flashing beneath the stars. They burned the fields, shattered the granaries, and cut down those who dared resist. Nafrini had hidden in the reeds, heart hammering against the tiny flutter of her child. She had watched her husband, strong and tall, fall beneath a foreign spear. She had bitten her hand to keep from crying out. When the fires had consumed the village, and the screams had faded into silence, she had fled, choosing the pitiless desert over the certainty of death. Now the desert mocked her, offering no path, no sign, only endless waves of heat. Her strength ebbed with each step. The child within her kicked weakly, as if sensing her despair. She sank to her knees, the sand scalding against her skin. Her hands groped blindly, clawing at the ground as if she could dig a grave and end the suffering. The world spun. She collapsed, face pressed into the burning earth. Tears mingled with the dust on her cheeks. She whispered a prayer to the gods, to Isis, to Hathor, to any who might hear a dying woman's plea. Save my child. Even if I must perish, save him. But the heavens remained silent, the sun indifferent, as the last of her strength bled away and darkness crept in from the edges of her vision. She heard it, a sound not born of the desert. Hoofbeats, faint at first, like the heartbeat of the earth itself, growing louder, closer. She forced her cracked eyes open and glimpsed a shape on the horizon, blurred and shifting. A horse, a rider. For a heartbeat, she thought it might be death itself come to claim her. She had heard tales in her childhood of Anubis riding out to fetch lost souls from the desert. She smiled faintly at the thought. At least she would not die alone. The figure drew nearer. Through the haze, she saw a man clad in simple traveling robes, a water skin slung across his saddle, a wrapped bundle strapped behind him. His horse was thin and dust-streaked, but strong. He pulled the beast to a stop and dismounted swiftly, kicking up a cloud of sand. He knelt beside her without hesitation, brushing the hair from her sun-scorched face. His hands were calloused but gentle. He said something, words lost to her ears, as if the desert had stolen all sound. She could only stare up at him with hollow eyes. Without speaking further, the man uncorked his water skin and pressed it to her lips. Cool liquid, tasting sweeter than any wine, spilled into her mouth. She coughed and sputtered but drank greedily. Next, He tore a piece of bread from his bundle and placed it in her hand, guiding it to her mouth. It was coarse and dry, but it might as well have been the food of the gods. She wept openly, the bread mixing with her tears. Only after she had swallowed and the worst of the burning hunger had abated did he finally speak, his voice low and kind. "What is your name, sister?" he asked. His eyes were dark and serious, the eyes of a man who had seen suffering before. Nafrini tried to answer, but her throat only managed a hoarse whisper. Still, she smiled. This man had fed her, had saved her life, without even knowing who she was. For the first time in what felt like centuries, she dared to hope. The man moved quickly, working with the efficiency of someone who had rescued the dying before. His fingers brushed sand from Nafrini's cracked skin with surprising tenderness, his rough palms cradling her head as he poured another careful stream of water past her lips. The world remained a shimmering haze around her, but a thread of life had been pulled back from the abyss. She clung to it desperately, forcing herself to breathe, to swallow, to exist. When she could take no more water, he shifted his attention to his horse, retrieving a bundle wrapped in coarse linen. From it, he produced strips of dried meat and dates pressed into sticky cakes. He tore a piece of the meat and pressed it into her hands. She ate without thought, the salt and fat reviving her more than prayer ever could. The dates followed, their sweetness flooding her senses with a jolt of strength. The man said nothing, only watched with patient, steady eyes, his brow furrowed in concern. When she had eaten enough to sit up, he draped a light cloth across her shoulders to shield her from the merciless sun and offered her more water. Each sip seemed to stitch her soul more firmly back into her body. She was alive. The child within her stirred again, stronger now, as if sensing safety. Tears welled up again, but this time they came from gratitude so profound it hollowed her chest. She managed to whisper, "Thank you," though her voice cracked like a broken reed. He smiled, a faint, fleeting thing, and dipped his head in acknowledgement. Only then did he speak again, his voice low, shaped by the desert winds. "You are safe now, sister. I am called Menmaatre. My caravan was delayed by the rising sands. I traveled ahead alone to scout for a path." His eyes flickered over the dunes with the wariness of a seasoned traveler. "The gods must have placed you in my way." Nafrini tried to speak her name, but her throat rebelled. Menmaatre shook his head gently. "No need," he said. "Not yet. Rest first." Without another word, he lifted her into his arms. She was feather-light, the burden of a woman and her unborn child reduced by starvation and suffering. She gasped in pain as her body protested, but he murmured soothing words in a dialect so old she barely understood. His horse, a weathered gray mare, knelt obediently as Menmaatre secured Nafrini before him in the saddle. He mounted behind her with practiced ease, holding her carefully against his chest. The warmth of his body and the steady beat of his heart were a strange comfort as they began to move. The desert stretched endlessly around them, a golden sea under the burning sky. Yet, with each step of the horse, Nafrini felt a sliver of hope threading its way through her broken soul. They traveled in silence. Words were unnecessary in the sacred hush that fell over them. Menmaatre guided the horse with the lightest of touches, his gaze scanning the horizon for danger. Raiders, wild beasts, sudden storms, these were constant threats, and he remained vigilant. But Nafrini could only lean against him, letting the rhythm of the ride lull her into a half-sleep. Time lost meaning. The sun began to dip, casting long shadows across the dunes, painting the sands in hues of blood and fire. As dusk approached, Menmaatre steered the horse toward a cluster of stones half buried in the sand, an abandoned shrine, its weathered columns standing like solemn sentinels against the sky. He dismounted first, then lifted Nafrini down with infinite care. She tried to stand but collapsed again. He caught her effortlessly, lowering her onto a cool slab of stone. The ruined shrine offered meager shelter, but it was enough. Menmaatre tethered his horse and set about building a small fire from dried brush he had collected along the way. As the first flames caught, he prepared a simple meal: more dried meat, some stale barley bread softened with water, and a handful of precious dates. He fed Nafrini by hand when her fingers trembled too much to hold the food. Embers flickered in the gathering darkness, casting wavering shadows over his face. For the first time, Nafrini studied him. He was not young, nor old. His skin was sun-darkened, his jaw lined with the beginnings of age, but his eyes, those deep, steady eyes, held a wisdom she had rarely seen even among the priests. A man of burdens, a man who had known loss. She wanted to ask him questions: where he came from, why he traveled alone, what sorrow had carved the lines into his face. But her body demanded rest. He must have seen the struggle in her eyes, for he shook out a thin sleeping mat beside the fire and helped her onto it. He placed his own blanket over her, though the desert night was still warm. "Sleep," he said simply. "Tomorrow we move toward the river. You need the river." She nodded weakly, the weight of exhaustion pressing her down. The fire crackled softly. The stars emerged one by one, diamond shards scattered across a velvet sky. Nafrini lay listening to the sound of Menmaatre's soft breathing, the faint stamp of the horse's hooves in the sand, the whisper of the desert winds. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she was not alone in her suffering, and for the first time she allowed herself to believe that she might yet live to see her child born beneath a gentler sun. The dawn rose over the broken shrine in a wash of pale gold, softening the harsh lines of stone and sand alike. Nafrini stirred beneath the borrowed blanket, the coolness of the desert night yielding reluctantly to the first warmth of morning. Her body ached from head to toe, but the deep, gnawing agony of hunger and thirst had dulled to a manageable throb. She opened her eyes to find Menmaatre crouched by the dwindling fire, methodically preparing what little provisions remained. His movements were steady, economical, shaped by long practice and necessity. For a moment she simply watched him, the way his broad shoulders moved beneath his worn linen robe, the way his hands, scarred and strong, handled each task with reverence as though each act was a prayer to the gods who had forsaken them both. When he noticed her gaze, he offered a small nod, not with the stiffness of a stranger, but with the quiet familiarity of someone who expected nothing in return. He passed her a small cup fashioned from a cracked shell, filled with water he must have rationed with painful care. She drank slowly, preserving each drop, feeling strength seep back into her battered limbs. They ate in silence, sharing dried meat and softened bread, each bite a precious thing in the vast emptiness around them. When they finished, Menmaatre stood and dusted off his hands, his eyes scanning the horizon. "We must move," he said, his voice roughened by the dry air. "The river lies to the east. If we are swift, we can reach it before the second sun." Nafrini nodded, though fear twisted her stomach. Every part of her body screamed for rest, yet the memory of dying alone in the sand was fresher, sharper. With Menmaatre's help, she rose unsteadily to her feet. He secured the sleeping mat and remaining provisions to the horse, then turned to her, offering his hand. She hesitated for a heartbeat before placing her palm against his. His skin was rough, but his grip was steady, solid, real. He lifted her onto the horse once more, mounting behind her with the ease of a man who had traveled alone for far too long. The horse snorted and stamped, then moved forward with a steady pace, carrying them across the endless dunes. The sun climbed higher, baking the earth, turning every breath into an effort. Nafrini sagged against Menmaatre, her body too frail to hold itself upright for long. He adjusted his hold, careful to support her swollen belly with one arm, while guiding the horse with the other. His presence was a wall against despair, shielding her from the terror that lurked just beyond thought, the terror that she would never see the Nile again, never cradle her child beneath the cool shade of papyrus reeds. As they rode, Nafrini closed her eyes and let the memories come. She remembered her mother's laughter, the songs sung at harvest, the way her husband had kissed her brow when he learned he would become a father. Those things seemed impossibly distant now, like half-remembered dreams from another life. Yet, with each step the horse took eastward, a tiny ember of those memories began to glow again, stubborn and defiant. Hours passed. The sun blazed overhead, merciless and blinding. Menmaatre paused only briefly at midday, seeking a sliver of shade beneath a crumbling stone outcrop. He gave her water, rubbed her hands and feet to keep her blood moving, forced her to eat a few bites even when she shook her head weakly. His care was not born of duty, but of something older, deeper, a fierce commitment that needed no words. When they moved again, the dunes gave way to flatter, harder ground. In the far distance, Nafrini thought she saw a smudge of green against the endless gold, but she dared not hope too soon. Her mind drifted into fevered dreams as they rode, visions of great temples rising from the desert, of gods and goddesses beckoning her forward. She saw Isis with her wings outstretched, shielding her and her child from harm, and she wept silently, not knowing if it was a true vision or merely the hallucination of a broken mind. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, turning the world to molten amber, Menmaatre pulled the horse to a halt atop a ridge. There, in the distance, gleaming like a jewel against the dying light, lay the Nile. Its waters shimmered in the last rays of the sun, winding through the parched land like the veins of a living god. Nafrini gasped aloud, her hand flying to her mouth. Tears blurred her vision, but she could not look away. Salvation lay before them. Menmaatre's arm tightened around her, steadying her trembling form. "We are close now," he murmured. "Hold on, sister. The gods have not turned their faces from you." His words, simple and unadorned, struck her harder than any grand proclamation could have. She believed him. Against all reason, all evidence, she believed. With renewed determination, she clung to him as the horse picked its way down the rocky slope, each step carrying her closer to life, to hope, to a future she had dared not dream of. As night fell and the stars emerged one by one, Nafrini whispered a silent vow to the unseen gods who had guided Menmaatre to her. If she lived, if her child lived, she would never again take for granted the sacred gift of life. She would honor the man who had fed her before knowing her name. She would carve his kindness into the bones of her soul, carrying it forward into whatever life remained to her beyond the desert. The descent to the river was harder than Nafrini had imagined, each step of the horse jarring her bones and stirring a fresh storm of pain through her weary body. But she gritted her teeth and clung to Menmaatre with every shred of strength she had left, her hands fisting into the folds of his robe as though he were the anchor that could keep her from slipping back into the arms of death. And perhaps he was, for even as the ground shifted treacherously beneath them and the desert winds howled like vengeful spirits, he held her steady, guiding the horse with quiet mastery down the rocky escarpment until at last they reached the lower plain, where scrub grasses clawed their way out of the hard-packed earth and the scent of water hung heavy in the air. A smell so rich and pure that it made Nafrini weep again without shame. Because it was life. It was salvation. It was everything she had dared not believe she would reach when she first stumbled alone across the dunes. And now here it was. Close enough that the wind brought the soft murmur of the current to her ears. Close enough that she could almost taste it on her cracked lips. Menmaatre urged the horse forward, sparing only the briefest of glances toward the crumbling ruins of an ancient way station, long abandoned by travelers, its broken columns jutting from the sand like the ribs of a dead beast. And Nafrini understood without needing him to explain that they could not linger there, that whatever had once sheltered pilgrims now belonged to snakes and scorpions, not to the living. The river lay beyond a narrow stretch of barren mud flats, and when they finally reached the water's edge, Menmaatre dismounted first, his movements swift and sure despite the exhaustion that lined his face, then turned to lift her down from the saddle with the same care he had shown since the moment he had first found her half dead among the dunes, his hands supporting her weight without strain as he carried her to the very brink of the river and knelt with her cradled against him. The two of them small and fragile, against the vastness of sky and water and dying light. Nafrini sobbed openly now, dipping her hands into the cool flow, bringing handful after handful to her mouth, feeling the water sluice away the last grime of despair clinging to her soul, feeling the child within her stir more strongly, as if he too drank in the strength of the sacred river. Menmaatre did not rush her. He waited, patient and silent, his eyes watchful as she drank, as she bathed her arms and face, as she let the current wash over her cracked feet. When at last she leaned back against him, utterly spent but filled with a trembling kind of hope, he smiled down at her, a rare and unguarded expression that made him seem suddenly younger, less burdened by whatever past weighed upon his shoulders. "You are strong, sister," he said, his voice soft and sure. "Stronger than the desert, stronger than fear." She wanted to answer, to tell him that it was his strength that had carried her this far, that without him she would be nothing more than a nameless corpse, buried beneath shifting dunes. But her throat closed with emotion, and all she could do was grip his hand tightly, hoping he understood what words could not express. As night deepened around them, Menmaatre gathered driftwood from the riverbank and built a small fire in a hollow shielded from the wind, the flames dancing brightly as if celebrating their arrival at this oasis of survival. He prepared another simple meal from his dwindling supplies, and once again, he fed her first before touching any food himself, tearing pieces of bread and dried fish into small bites she could manage, offering her water between each mouthful, never hurrying, never letting impatience show in the set of his mouth or the line of his brow. Only when she had eaten her fill did he allow himself a few bites, and even then, he kept a wary eye on the darkness beyond their circle of light, ever the guardian, ever the silent sentinel against whatever dangers might lurk in the night. Sleep came to Nafrini in fits and starts, each doze broken by the ache of her body or the restless stirring of the child inside her. But Menmaatre was always there, adjusting the blanket when she shivered, murmuring quiet reassurances that seemed to weave themselves into her dreams. Once, when she woke gasping from a nightmare of fire and blood, she found his hand resting lightly on hers, grounding her, pulling her back from the edge of terror. The river sang all around them, a low, endless hymn that spoke of life and death and rebirth, of kingdoms rising and falling, of all things flowing inevitably toward their fate. And in the hush between heartbeats, in the spaces where grief and gratitude met, Nafrini realized something she had not dared believe before. She was no longer alone. Menmaatre had not only fed her body, he had fed her spirit, had given her a chance to hope, to fight, to believe that the gods had not entirely abandoned the world to darkness and cruelty. She clutched that fragile realization to her heart like a talisman, vowing silently to herself and to the unborn life she carried that she would endure, that she would reclaim her place beneath the sacred sun, that she would not let the desert claim her soul. Somewhere beyond the river, life awaited, a life she would seize with both hands, no matter what trials still lay ahead. Morning rose slow and heavy, the sky a pale wash of gold above the still and silent river, the world wrapped in a strange and sacred hush that seemed almost to hold its breath as Nafrini stirred beneath the thin blanket, feeling the weight of her own survival settle over her like a second skin, heavier than linen, heavier than fear, heavier even than the child who moved restlessly within her, impatient for a world he had not yet seen. She blinked against the early light, her body aching but her spirit sharper, stronger, forged in the fires of pain and carried now by something more enduring, something born from the hands that had lifted her, the water that had fed her, the voice that had called her sister without knowing her name. Menmaatre crouched by the river's edge, washing his hands in the slow current, his face turned slightly away from her, lost in thought. There was a stillness about him that spoke of wounds unseen, of battles fought not with blades, but with memory. And for a long moment Nafrini simply watched him, feeling a strange peace settle into her bones, a tether binding her not only to life, but to this man who had chosen mercy over indifference, who had given freely when he had so little left to give. She shifted, and the small sound drew his gaze. His mouth curved into that quiet, fleeting smile she had come to recognize, a smile that carried with it neither pity nor expectation, only simple, steadfast humanity. He rose and crossed to her, kneeling easily despite the stiffness she knew he must carry after the long ride and restless night, and offered her a cup of water from the river, fresh and clean and cool as hope itself. She drank gratefully, then struggled to sit up, feeling the stubbornness in her blood awaken fully now that the worst of her weakness had passed. Menmaatre did not ask if she was ready to move. He simply waited, letting her find her own strength without pressure. When at last she was upright and steady, he helped her to the horse, his hands careful as ever, mindful of her swollen belly, of the fragile life cradled within. Together they rode eastward along the river's edge, the land slowly changing around them, the sand giving way to thickets of papyrus and reeds, to birds that rose in startled clouds from the water's edge, to the distant glint of fishing boats bobbing like forgotten toys on the horizon. Civilization, the world of the living. Nafrini's heart clenched painfully at the sight, a sudden, terrible fear knotting in her chest. What place was there for her among the living now? A widowed, starving woman heavy with child, with no family, no home, no name anyone would care to hear. Yet Menmaatre rode onward without hesitation, and she clung to the faith that had carried her this far. They passed fields where farmers bent over young shoots of barley and emmer wheat, their feet sunk deep in the muddy banks of the flooded Nile, and though many looked up at the sight of the strangers, no one hailed them, no one offered challenge or greeting. Perhaps it was the sight of Nafrini's hollow cheeks and sunburned skin, or the wary set of Menmaatre's shoulders, or perhaps the gods themselves veiled them from unwanted eyes. Whatever the reason, they moved unimpeded, following a narrow track that twisted through fields and orchards until at last they reached a cluster of mud brick houses huddled against the river, smoke curling lazily from cook fires, the air rich with the scents of baking bread, roasting fish, and sweet dates left to dry in the sun. Menmaatre slowed the horse and dismounted, lifting Nafrini down with the same reverence he had shown since the beginning, as if she were a sacred relic and not a broken, battered woman. He led her toward the largest house, its doorway shaded by a simple linen curtain, and called out a greeting in a language older than the stone temples, rough and musical and filled with the weight of shared history. A woman answered, stepping into the light, a woman broad of hip and strong of arm, her skin darkened by the sun, her eyes sharp and appraising. She took in Nafrini's condition at a glance, her mouth tightening not in judgment but in something closer to sorrow. She spoke a few swift words to Menmaatre, who nodded, then turned to Nafrini. "You will rest here," he said, his voice gentler than she had ever heard it. "You and your child will be safe." Nafrini wanted to weep again, but the tears would not come. She managed a nod, swaying on her feet, and the strong-armed woman stepped forward to catch her, guiding her inside with a tenderness that made her heart break anew. Menmaatre remained outside, speaking softly with another man who had joined him, their words low and urgent. Nafrini sat in the cool, shadowed room, the smell of bread and herbs enveloping her, the walls lined with simple mats and baskets, the air humming with the promise of life. She had no possessions, no name that mattered here, nothing but the child who kicked restlessly within her, and the memory of a man who had lifted her from death without asking who she was. She closed her eyes and whispered her name into the hollow space between heartbeats. A promise carried on the wind. "Nafrini," she said. "I am Nafrini, and I will live." The woman who had taken Nafrini into her home worked swiftly and without unnecessary words, her hands strong and sure as she guided Nafrini onto a woven mat near the hearth where the lingering heat of the night's fire warmed the air. And before Nafrini could even gather the strength to ask her name, she found a clay bowl pressed into her hands, filled with a steaming broth rich with lentils and wild herbs, the scent of it making her stomach clench painfully with hunger. and she obeyed without question when the woman gestured for her to eat, forcing the trembling of her fingers to still as she lifted the bowl to her lips and drank deeply, the nourishment flooding her body like river water rushing into dry, cracked earth. The woman knelt beside her, inspecting the state of her feet and legs, clucking softly under her breath at the angry blisters and deep cuts. And before Nafrini could protest, she had risen and returned with a jar of thick salve. It smelled sharp with honey and myrrh, and she began to work it gently into Nafrini's torn skin, her touch firm but careful, her eyes never once flickering with pity or disgust, only the measured focus of someone who had tended to too many broken bodies to be surprised by another. As she worked, another figure appeared at the doorway, an old man, bent with age but moving with the slow assurance of experience, and he carried with him a bundle of wrapped linen and a satchel heavy with the clink of pottery and bone. And when he entered the room, the woman nodded briefly and stepped back, allowing him to kneel at Nafrini's side, his gnarled fingers surprisingly gentle as he lifted her wrist and pressed 2 fingers against the pulse there, his brow furrowing slightly as he listened to whatever message the racing beat of her heart sent through her blood. He spoke then, his voice low and rhythmic, chanting prayers to Anubis and to Isis, weaving their names together in a cadence that seemed to wrap the room in a web of protection. And as he murmured, he anointed her forehead with oil, drew symbols in the air above her womb, whispered blessings into the spaces between her heartbeats. Nafrini could not understand every word. The dialect was old, from the first dynasties, but the intent rang clear enough, a plea for safe passage through the gates of suffering, a call to the gods to guard mother and child alike. The old man finished his work with a final flourish of his hands, tying a simple woven charm around Nafrini's wrist, a tiny amulet shaped like an ankh, the symbol of life, its blue glaze worn smooth by countless prayers. He patted her shoulder once, then withdrew, his task complete, and the woman resumed her place beside the hearth, stirring a new pot whose aroma promised another meal. Only then did Nafrini allow her body to sag fully against the mat, her hands resting protectively over her swollen belly, her mind reeling from the strangeness of it all, the sudden shift from death to life, from despair to hope, from endless sand to this cool, sheltered place where people treated her as if she mattered, as if her survival were not an accident but a duty they had willingly embraced. Hours passed, or perhaps only moments. Time was a river that slipped through her fingers faster than she could measure. Menmaatre returned once, standing in the doorway with his arms folded across his chest, his face unreadable in the dim light. Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them, a thread of understanding too deep for speech. She inclined her head in silent gratitude, and he answered with the smallest of nods before turning away, leaving her in the hands of those who could do what he could not, heal what the desert had tried to break. As evening fell and the world outside cooled into shades of indigo and silver, the woman who had taken charge of Nafrini at last spoke her name, Tia, and with that single word a bond was formed, not of blood, but of something perhaps stronger, forged in the shared knowledge of suffering and the stubborn refusal to let it consume them. Tia sat with her into the night, recounting small stories of the village, of children who had survived fevers, of harvests rescued from floods, of travelers who had come and gone along the river's winding paths. And though Nafrini barely spoke, she listened, drinking in the rhythm of normal life like a parched earth soaks up the first rains of spring. Sleep finally took her in the small hours, a deep, dreamless sleep, cradled by the warmth of the fire and the steady, living hum of a house built to endure. She dreamed of water, of fields green and wide, of a child's laughter floating on the wind, and when she woke to the soft light of dawn, she knew without question that she had crossed a threshold, that the woman she had been, the one who staggered alone across the endless dunes, nameless and forgotten, was gone. In her place was someone new, someone tempered by suffering and fed by mercy, someone who had not yet been defeated. She would rise, she would endure. And when the time came, she would stand beneath the sun with her child in her arms, and she would remember not only the pain, but the hands that healed her, the man who saved her, and the gods who had, against all odds, heard her broken prayer. The days that followed unfolded like the slow turning of a sacred wheel, each sunrise peeling back another layer of numbness from Nafrini's soul as she grew stronger under Tia's care, each breath a little fuller, each step a little steadier, her body knitting itself back together with the quiet determination of something too stubborn to die. And though her belly grew heavier with the weight of life inside her, she no longer feared it would be wasted on the sands. For now there was shelter. Now there were hands that would catch her when the time came. Now there was a future she could almost see rising on the horizon like the first pale light before dawn. Tia taught her how to move again, coaxing strength into her weakened limbs with the same fierce patience she used to tend her garden or sew a broken basket, never rushing, never scolding, simply believing without words that Nafrini could and would endure. Some days they sat together by the river, weaving mats or grinding grain, the easy silence between them more comforting than any song. And in those moments Nafrini found a kind of peace she had never known even in her village before the raiders came, a peace rooted not in safety but in survival, in the knowledge that she had been broken and was mending, slow but sure, like the river carving its endless path through stone. Menmaatre came and went, always silent, always watchful, sometimes bringing bundles of fish or wild dates he had traded for, sometimes simply standing at the edge of the courtyard with his arms folded, his presence a steady reassurance that though he had returned her to safety, he had not abandoned her to it, that his role in her life had not ended with a gift of water and bread. He never asked for thanks, never sought her out with words, but Nafrini felt his gaze often, felt the weight of his quiet faith in her, and it humbled her more than grand gestures ever could. She learned from Tia that Menmaatre had no fixed home, that he traveled from village to village along the river, mending tools, healing animals, settling disputes, a man belonging not to any one place but to the wide, wandering world itself. And when Nafrini heard this, she understood why there was a sorrow woven through his silences, why his laughter, rare and soft, carried the sharp tang of loss. One evening, as the sun bled out over the western horizon and the first stars kindled in the deepening sky, Tia urged Nafrini outside, wrapping a woven shawl around her thin shoulders and leading her to the riverbank where Menmaatre waited, a small fire crackling at his feet, its smoke rising in slender columns toward the heavens. He gestured for her to sit, and she obeyed without speaking, settling onto the smooth sand, feeling the cool kiss of the night air on her skin. For a long time they sat in silence, listening to the murmur of the water, the distant cries of night birds, the crackling of the fire, and then, without looking at her, Menmaatre spoke. He told her of his village, long swallowed by the sands when the river had changed its course, of his family, lost to sickness in a year when the floods failed and the gods seemed deaf to every prayer, of how he had taken to wandering, carrying his knowledge of healing in his stubborn heart from place to place, never staying long enough to belong, never risking the pain of building something that could be torn away again. His words were simple, almost halting, as if he were unaccustomed to speaking of himself, but every syllable rang true in the quiet air, and Nafrini listened with her whole being, understanding more from what he did not say than from what he did. When he finished, he turned his gaze to her, and for the first time since they met, he asked a question of her past, not as a demand, but as an offering, an invitation to step into the light with him. Nafrini found herself speaking of her village, of the laughter and music, of the hope she had carried like treasures tucked into her robes, of the night the raiders came and the fire swallowed everything she had ever known. Her voice shook but did not break, and when she spoke of her husband's death, of the moment she chose to flee into the desert rather than die at the hands of beasts in human skin, she saw no judgment in Menmaatre's face, only sorrow and pride, intertwined like two vines climbing the same broken wall. The fire crackled low between them, casting long shadows over their faces, and as she finished her story, the weight of it slipped from her shoulders, leaving her lighter, freer, not whole, perhaps, but healing. They sat beneath the shelter of stars, two souls carved by the same cruel world, and though no promises passed between them, no oaths were spoken. Nafrini felt something shift in the quiet space they shared, something tender and fierce and fragile as a new shoot pushing up through dry soil. She touched her swollen belly and smiled, a small, secret smile, and when she looked up, she saw Menmaatre smiling too, a rare, unguarded smile that lit the night more brightly than any fire. The days that followed moved like a dream half-remembered, a fragile piece strung together from the simple acts of living, the mending of baskets, the baking of bread, the laughter of children playing in the dusty courtyard, the slow weaving of a life not grand or gilded but solid, rooted in the sacred act of survival. And for the first time since the night her village burned, Nafrini began to imagine a future not filled with flight and fear, but with the steady beat of days measured by the rise and fall of the river, the planting and the harvest, the quiet joys of small things. Tia taught her the rhythms of the village, the times to pray, the times to work, the ways to read the river's moods by the color of its waters and the flights of birds along its banks. And Nafrini learned quickly, her body still weak, but her spirit eager, fueled by the life inside her that seemed to grow stronger with each passing hour. Menmaatre remained a steady presence, never imposing, never demanding, simply there, mending a broken yoke for a farmer one day, tending a sick child another, always finding time to check on Nafrini with a quiet word, a nod, a rare smile that made her chest ache with something she dared not yet name. And yet, beneath the gentle hum of life, there was a tension that neither she nor the others could deny, a shadow that grew with each sunset, carried on the wind like the scent of smoke from a distant fire. Whispers moved through the village like snakes through tall grass, whispers of raiders pushing farther along the riverbanks, of villages sacked and burned, of soldiers too few and too slow to stop them. The memory of what had been done to her people made Nafrini's blood run cold, and though Tia's face remained calm, Nafrini saw the extra jars of grain she carefully hid beneath mats, the water skins she quietly filled and set near the door, the small sharp knife she slipped under her pillow each night. They were not safe. Not truly. The gods had granted them a reprieve, not a pardon. One evening, as the sun bled into the river and the sky blazed red and furious, Menmaatre came to the house with his face carved into lines of grim resolve. Tia met him at the door, speaking in low, hurried tones that Nafrini could not hear, but when she caught Menmaatre's eye across the courtyard, she knew. It was in the set of his jaw, the tightness of his shoulders. Danger was coming. That night, after the house had gone still and only the crickets and the slow lap of the river kept vigil, Menmaatre found her sitting alone by the hearth, her hands absently stroking the curve of her belly, her heart pounding against her ribs like a drum. He knelt beside her, his voice low and sure. "We must be ready to leave," he said. "If they come, we cannot stay and fight. The village is too small, too poor to defend. We must move before they arrive." Fear rose in her like a tide, but she forced herself to meet his gaze, to let his steadiness anchor her. "When?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "At first light," he replied. "We will follow the old fisherman's path south, along the smaller canals. It will be harder, slower, but it will hide us." She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She trusted him. She would follow him anywhere. Tia packed quickly and without fuss, wrapping food, water, blankets into neat bundles, strapping them to the backs of the village's few sturdy donkeys. The villagers gathered silently in the darkness, their faces pale and grim in the light of the torches, the children clinging to their mothers, the old men clutching staffs and amulets as if they alone could hold back the tide of violence. Menmaatre took command without ceremony, his quiet authority a balm against the growing panic. He assigned the strongest to guard the flanks, the swiftest to scout ahead. The elders and the children placed in the center of their small, desperate procession. When all was ready, he came to Nafrini, lifting her gently onto the back of a donkey, adjusting the blankets around her so she would not feel the worst of the jostling ride. He said nothing, but his hands lingered a moment longer than necessary, and when she reached out to touch his wrist, he did not pull away. The stars overhead were sharp and cold, the river a black ribbon beside them as they moved southward, slipping through the darkness like ghosts, every footstep a prayer, every breath a plea to the gods for mercy, for safety, for one more sunrise. Nafrini clutched the woven charm around her wrist, feeling the shape of the ankh pressed against her palm, and whispered silent promises to her unborn child that they would reach safety, that she would not let the world break her again, that somehow, against all odds, they would find a place to call home. The night stretched long and full of shadows, and somewhere behind them, beyond the quiet fields and sleeping palms, the storm they fled from gathered strength, roaring silently across the desert. They moved through the darkness like whispers, the village fleeing on weary feet, every step along the narrow fisherman's path a gamble between hope and despair. The black ribbon of the Nile, their only guide under a sky heavy with stars. And though the night was cool, Nafrini felt the heat of fear pressing against her back, the knowledge that somewhere behind them, the raiders would find only empty homes and cold ashes and would not forgive the insult, would not relent until blood answered the defiance of flight. Menmaatre led them with relentless focus, his silhouette always just ahead of Nafrini's donkey, pausing often to listen to the wind, to study the stars, to judge the river's voice, as if he could read the god's will in every breath of night air, and she clung to that faith, clung to the certainty that if anyone could guide them through the jaws of death, it was him. The children did not cry. Even the youngest had learned to be silent, to swallow their terror, their tiny faces wide-eyed and watchful as they stumbled along beside their mothers. And every so often Tia would fall back beside Nafrini, pressing a reassuring hand to her arm, a silent promise that she would not be left behind. The path grew more treacherous as they moved southward, broken by dry gullies and sudden outcrops of stone. And more than once the donkeys stumbled, men cursing softly as they righted them. But always they moved forward, because behind them death rode on the desert winds. Hours stretched long and shapeless, and exhaustion gnawed at them all, but no one dared speak of rest, not when every heartbeat felt borrowed. Then, just before the first pale blush of dawn, it happened. The cry of warning from the rear, sharp and thin as a dagger's thrust, and Menmaatre did not hesitate. He turned immediately, his voice cutting through the hush like a blade, ordering the villagers to scatter into the reeds, to hide where the thick grasses would cover them, to abandon the path if they wished to live. Chaos rippled through their small band, mothers lifting children into their arms, old men gripping walking sticks as if they were spears, bundles of food and blankets dropping into the dust as survival took precedence over possessions. Menmaatre reached Nafrini's side in a heartbeat, his hands strong as he pulled her down from the donkey, half carrying, half dragging her toward the thickest stand of papyrus. She gasped as the sudden movement jolted her belly, sharp pain flashing through her abdomen. But she bit down on her scream, clenching her teeth so hard she tasted blood. He pushed aside the reeds and lowered her into the sheltering dark between the thick stalks, his face inches from hers, his breath harsh in the cold air. "Stay," he ordered, his hand brushing briefly over her cheek, a touch as fleeting as it was desperate. And then he was gone, melting into the shadows like smoke. Nafrini crouched low, pressing both hands to her belly, feeling the frantic flutter of life within her, and she prayed, not in the formal language of the temples, but in the broken, raw words of a mother begging the gods to spare her child. The sounds of pursuit grew louder, the harsh clatter of sandals on stone, the shouts of men drunk on the promise of easy slaughter, and then the clash of bodies, the wet, brutal sound of flesh meeting flesh, the scream of a donkey in terror. She could see nothing through the thick reeds, only the flicker of torches dancing wildly against the sky, only the terrible certainty that their fragile chance at survival was tearing apart before her. Minutes, hours, heartbeats, it all blurred together, and when at last the sounds began to fade, replaced by the distant drumming of hooves retreating upriver, Nafrini dared to lift her head. Menmaatre returned first, his robe torn, a line of blood tracking down his arm, but his face was grimly determined, not broken, and behind him stumbled others. Tia, 3 of the elders, a scattering of mothers clutching wide-eyed children, but too few, far too few. She did not see some faces she knew she should have, did not hear the soft cough of the old fisherman who had once shared his dates with her, did not catch the proud stride of the young boy who had teased the goats at sunset. Death had taken its due. Menmaatre knelt before her, reaching out, his hands trembling slightly as he checked her limbs, her face, her belly, his voice low and hoarse as he asked if she was hurt, if the child stirred still within her. And when she nodded, when she whispered that she was whole, she saw the fierce, fleeting relief that crossed his face, the way his shoulders sagged as if the weight of the entire world had shifted slightly lighter. Around them, the survivors gathered, silent and shell-shocked, their eyes wide with the knowledge of what they had escaped and what they had lost. And in the growing light of dawn, as the first full sun rose blood-red over the bruised horizon, Nafrini knew that nothing of their old lives remained, nothing but the stubborn beating of their hearts and the thin, stubborn hope that had carried them this far. She pressed her hand over her belly, feeling the small, defiant kick of life within, and lifted her head to meet Menmaatre's gaze, not with despair, but with the grim, burning certainty that they would go on, that they would not let the desert or the raiders or even the gods themselves strip them of the future they had fought so bitterly to keep. They buried the dead at first light, not with the long rituals and chants that tradition demanded, but with the hurried reverence of those who knew that death was never far behind them still, piling stones over the bodies in the soft sand by the river's edge, whispering prayers beneath their breath, offering the only gifts they had left, their tears, their memories, their promises to remember. And when it was done, when the last rock had been placed and the last prayer murmured into the rising wind, they turned south once more, the broken procession of survivors moving with the grim silence of those who had given up everything but the will to endure. Nafrini rode slumped against Tia on the back of one of the last donkeys, her hands clasped protectively over her belly, every jolt of the animal's movement sending sharp pains through her. But she said nothing, burying her moans in the folds of her robe, focusing only on the rhythm of the donkey's steps, the pulse of life inside her. The sight of Menmaatre's figure just ahead, always ahead, carving a path through the chaos with a stubbornness that felt to her like the only thing holding the sky aloft. The sun rose higher, brutal and unrelenting, baking the sands and turning the air into a shimmering mirage of false rivers and phantom trees. And still they moved, heads bowed, mouths dry, prayers silent. It was near midday when Nafrini felt the first true pain, a deep, twisting agony that stole her breath and brought hot tears to her eyes, and she gasped, clutching at Tia's arm, her voice barely a whisper but urgent. Tia turned sharply, her wide, knowing eyes narrowing as she read the truth in Nafrini's face, and without a word she called out to Menmaatre, who was at her side in moments, his face tight with concern. They helped her down from the donkey, carrying her between them to the shade of a narrow stand of scrub trees by the water, their movements swift but careful, the others forming a loose circle around them, a human shield against the world's cruelty. And there, on a bed of hastily laid blankets, with the river singing low and endless beside her, and the sun blazing in the cloudless sky above, Nafrini's time came. The pains racked her body, wave after merciless wave, and she clutched Tia's hands, biting down on every scream until her mouth tasted of blood. And Menmaatre was there too, kneeling behind Tia, his voice steady and low, guiding, encouraging, pouring strength into her with every word, every glance. And she thought that if the gods had meant her to die here, She would defy them one last time. She would bring this child into the world even if it tore her in half. Hours passed in a haze of agony and prayer, the world narrowing to the beating of her heart, the crushing grip of her body as it fought to give life. And when at last, with a cry that ripped the very sky, the child slipped free into Tia's waiting hands, the world seemed to shudder and still, a moment carved out of the endless flow of time where only breath and blood and miracle existed. The child wailed, strong and fierce, a sound more beautiful than any music Nafrini had ever heard, and Tia lifted him high for her to see. A boy, red and wrinkled and perfect, his tiny fists already punching at the air as if daring the world to challenge him. Tears streamed down Nafrini's face as she reached out trembling arms, and Tia placed the child against her chest, his skin hot and slippery against hers, his heartbeat a wild flutter beneath her palm. And in that moment, beneath the shelter of scrub trees and endless sky, Nafrini felt something inside her shatter and reforge anew. A love so vast and fierce it eclipsed pain, fear, sorrow. Menmaatre crouched beside her, his face unreadable, and she looked up at him through her tears and whispered, "His name is Menmaatre," the name she had carried in her heart since before the fire, the name her husband would have spoken with pride, the name that now lived on in the fragile, stubborn miracle of her son. Menmaatre nodded once, solemnly, as if acknowledging a pact older than kings and priests, and for the first time Nafrini saw his eyes glisten with unshed tears, saw the weight he carried lift just a little. The villagers gathered closer, smiling, weeping, reaching out tentative hands to bless the child, to bless the woman who had borne him out of death and despair into life and hope. They had lost so much, but here, in the cradle of dust and river water, life had risen again, defiant and unbroken. As night fell and the first stars pierced the cooling sky, Tia built a small fire, and they feasted on what little they had, sharing laughter and stories beneath the open heavens, weaving new memories to stitch over the torn seams of their past. Nafrini lay with her son cradled against her breast, Menmaatre seated nearby, his gaze never straying far from her, and she knew, with a certainty deeper than blood, that whatever storms still waited beyond the horizon, whatever trials still clawed their way toward them from the desert's cruel heart, they would face them together. She was no longer a broken girl wandering the sand. She was a mother, a survivor, a daughter of the river and the stars. And her child, her beautiful, stubborn child, was the living proof that mercy, like water, would always find a way through even the hardest stone.